So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I'm Louise Mirrer, New York Historical's president and CEO. And it really is a great pleasure for me to see all of you this evening in our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium. We are thrilled to welcome David M. Rubenstein back to New York Historical as moderator for this evening's program. Tonight's History with David M. Rubenstein program focuses on the Vietnam War. Mr. Rubenstein is the chairman of the Smithsonian Board of Regents. He added that job in October 2016, making a wonderful comment that I'm delighted to repeat tonight. "I love the museums," he said, "and I love the learning. It keeps me young." We are also delighted to welcome Ken Burns to the New York Historical Society this evening. Mr. Burns has been making documentary films for almost 40 years. Since the Academy Award nominated Brooklyn Bridge in 1981, he has gone on to direct and produce some of the most acclaimed historical documentaries ever. His films have been honored with dozens of major awards, including 15 Emmy Awards, 2 Grammy Awards, 2 Oscar nominations, and our very own New York Historical History Makers Award in 2016. And now, please join me in welcoming our guests. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, Ken, I guess I feel obliged to ask you, are you considering running for president of the United States?
No, definitely not.
Oh, okay.
I feel like I have the best job in the country.
Okay. So many people, we are roughly the same age, same generation. Many people in our generation wanted to go to law school or maybe medical school or something like that. When you told your family you wanted to be a documentary historian, what did they say?
Well, I think part of the reason why I arrived at that is that there wasn't much of that family left. And my mother had died of a 10-year battle of cancer when I was 11. You can imagine how demoralized the family was. My father was a cultural anthropologist, and I'm not that far off azimuth from that. But what I do for a living is wake the dead. And I had my late father-in-law was a psychologist who pointed this out to me at age 40, that I had some unresolved business with my mother that needed to be resolved. And so we've been waking the dead for 40 years.
All right, so how did you went to college, what did you study in college?
I studied filmmaking. Almost every course I could take was in filmmaking or film history or photography at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. It opened in the fall of 70. It opened in the fall of 70. I came in the fall of 71. It was kind of new, experimental for that time, undergraduate education, more like graduate school, and it permitted us to really dive deep into a particular area of expertise.
So when you graduated, what did you do? You just don't get a job that easily in filmmaking.
No, you don't. And I think that my naivete, my overwhelming naivete helped, because I graduated in the spring of 1975 and started a company called Florentine Films with 2 of my schoolmates, Roger Sherman and Buddy Squires, whom I still work with to this day. And we've never had other bosses. We've been making films I've been particularly focused in American history. All the films I've done have been in American history. For public television, almost from the very beginning. So you've
never had a boss?
Never had a boss.
So you're not missing anything?
No, I understand. I can tell because I am, in fact, the boss to a relatively small group of several dozen people, and I understand what being a boss is.
So what was your first film?
So I made a film at Hampshire College, which is sort of a senior thesis, called Working in Rural New England for Old Sturbridge Village. The one that really matters, that Louise was mentioning, was the first film for public broadcasting, which I finished in 1981. It was broadcast in '82, called Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was about to turn 100 the following year in 1983, and I had spent 5 years of my life, when I looked about 12 years old, trying to sell people the Brooklyn Bridge. I spent a lot of my time with the tin cup out, and in that days it was raising $1,000 from the New York Dock Railway or $2,500 from Abraham and Straus, a department store, and I was actually handed an envelope. It didn't have cash. I wish I could tell you it had cash in it. On the second floor walk-up on Montague Street in downtown Brooklyn by Meade Esposito, the head of the Kings County Democratic Party, who thought if any film was going to be made, as he put it, about his bridge, he ought to have some skin in the game. And of course, as everyone in this room knows, Meade Esposito died in jail.
So, all right, after that, you then did what which film next?
I did a history of the Shakers called Hands to Work and Hearts to God, then a biography of Huey Long, then a history of how the Statue of Liberty got built, and then started work on the Civil War then. I did a couple of other films on the Congress and Thomas Hart Benton while I was spending the 5.5 years working on the Civil War.
Remind people, on the Civil War, how long ago was that?
That came out in the fall of 1970, so a long time ago.
So it's, people
28
forget,
years.
it's how many years?
28 years
20 years
this
ago,
fall.
28
Yeah.
years, so
Yeah.
it seems like not that long ago.
No, and you know, the wonderful thing is that it's today is a school day in the United States, and PBS estimates that many hundreds, some, maybe even thousands of classrooms are looking at some of the Civil War today, as they did yesterday and will do tomorrow.
And it took you 5.5 years to do that? And where'd you get the money for it? How much did it cost?
So the budget for the Civil War was about $3.6 million. It came from General Motors, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and the MacArthur Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, who gave the largest grant of $1,449,500, which I repaid with program income within a year.
And
no one's ever done that in the history of the
And
National Endowment for the Humanities.
No money from Meade Esposito, right?
And no money from Meade Esposito for that film, right.
And how many people watched it?
PBS estimates that 40 million people watched some or all of the series when it was first shown, which is still the highest rated program in PBS history.
And just to remind people, in those days there were not as many, I guess, social media kinds of things.
Nothing.
So it was basically broadcast on how many consecutive nights? Was it?
So it was 5 nights. There were 9 episodes, but we stacked. The first night was the first episode, and the subsequent 4 nights had 2 different episodes, and we finished with the 9th on a Thursday night.
The music was quite lyrical. How did you pick that music, and where would the music ideas come from?
In all of the films that I had done before and all the films I've done subsequently, I've let the material sort of dictate what the music, the period, first of all. And so I had recorded with a guy that I know. I'd had him play on a piano all these hymns and popular songs from the era, and of course the martial music and the songs that the soldiers sang. And I picked out 30 or 40 and then went into a studio before we started editing and recorded 40 or 50 different versions of each of those 40 or 50 different songs. But one of my session musicians was a violinist who lives in West Hurley, New York, named Jay Unger. And he had written, a Jewish boy from the Bronx, he had written the most beautiful Scotch-Irish lament in 1983 called the Ashokan Farewell. The Ashokan there's a reservoir that's part of the network of reservoirs that satisfy our thirsts in the city. And he sat down after a music camp that he ran and wrote this beautiful thing. And I realized that that was the bridge to the moment. So every other piece of music is of the period of the Civil War, played with contemporary instruments, except this one that kind of helped us. And I tell you today, David, it's probably been played 1,000 times at a wedding or a funeral or a memorial service or a renewal of vows or something.
So once that became public, the Civil War series, you became relatively well known. And what became something that people are interested in, I'd like to ask you about, is your hairdo.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you get that hairdo? And what's the story about that?
It grows, actually.
Right. Well, it's better than the opposite.
I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, partly during the 1960s, and I had hair a hell of a lot longer than this. And sometime in the 70s, I just had it cut off by this young woman at a hair salon in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she wanted to go very slowly, and I said, no, and she did sort of about basically this, a little bit shorter, and then it grows out and I can't see anymore, which is going to be in about a week and a half, and then I kind of go mow the lawn, and then I go back, and I've been...
She's still cutting your hair?
And the same person, she's like a grandmother, she's retired, I have to go to her house now, and she still cuts the hair. I'm very, very loyal. I mean, I'm still using the same cinematographer that I started working with in 1973 or 4. My principal writer, Jeffrey Ward, I've been working with since the early 80s.
Is her rate for cutting your hair going up?
No, it's actually, I tip her heavily, and it's not Clintonian in its excess.
So let's talk about the Vietnam War series you've now done. How long did it take you to do this?
Well, if you take from the moment that I said yes to the project, which is just an internal thing. It was almost 11 years, 10 and a half, more than 10 and a half years. But of course, the first several years are trying to sort of master a little bit about the subject yourself. I've never done a film about something I've known about. You know, if you do that, then you're basically telling people what they should know rather than, that's called homework.
How do you do that? You read books?
I read books, we talk to scholars, we begin to think ourselves about how we do it. We look at art, we come to archives like this. I mean, I love the New York Historical Society from the very first film that I've done. It's been a resource along with, in the Civil War, 162 other sources. So we're traveling around the country, or in the case of Vietnam, around the world. We're trying to get a sense of it. We're looking for access. We're trying to figure out ways of approaching it. And what's important to understand about the Vietnam War is that we have learned so much since the fall of Saigon. There has been so much new scholarship that it has turned conventional wisdom that those of us who might have even been there or thought we knew about it because we protested it or certainly was alive and followed it on the nightly news, almost everything is turned upside down. And so I think it took us 2 or 3 years just to get some sea legs to begin to say, let's start interviewing, let's ask intelligent questions.
How much did it cost?
$30 million.
And where'd that money come from?
It came from a variety of sources. We had a corporate sponsor, no longer General Motors. It has been for the last many years, and they've, thank goodness, signed up until 2030, Bank of America. That's about a quarter we get from large institutional foundations like the Pew Charitable Trusts and Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, another quarter from the government sources like the National Endowment for the Humanities, but mostly the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS itself. It isn't the government, but it's people like you, thank you. And then I started, after the '08 meltdown, a group called the Better Angels Society, who are here, many people who are here today, that are individuals of wealth and small private family foundations who sort of picked up the slack. And that's how we've done it. It's still to this day incredibly labor intensive.
So the shooting of it took how long? The actual filming of it?
You know, we don't have the shooting days that Hollywood would say, well, we shot for 76 days in these 10 locations. We will shoot over many, many years, but we'll also be writing, we'll also be editing, we'll further research. Even when the film was done, and we, as it's called, locked it in, and no one believes this because of the similarities and the echoes with the present political circumstance, that we finished the film in 2015 and then spent a year and a half doing the post-production work, and were able to continue to check the facts and the dates and the numbers and change them as necessary, so that it reflects what I think is probably at least for a while, an aggregation of the central understanding of the Vietnam War among scholars, and most importantly, the people who were there or the people who protested it.
As a result of your research, what would you say is the biggest surprise to you, and the surprise that you expect people will see in the movie?
Well, you know, for me, having grown up in a college town, having sort of become aware as a human being with the Vietnam War, I thought I knew a lot. And so I think the biggest feeling was the sense of humiliation that I knew nothing about it. And that was daily. And after a while, you welcomed the unknowing. You welcomed taking a scene that was working and realizing that you had to make it more complicated. But I think for just the point of view of conversation, just the extent to which Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon all knew that this was never, ever going to work, and nonetheless plowed into it. And the other thing is that we thought we knew a little bit about our enemy, and we could ask most of the people in this audience who was running North Vietnam, and everyone would say Ho Chi Minh. But in point of fact, as our series in episode 1 pointed out, by 1959, and that's not a typo, he was marginalized and not the determining voice on the Politburo. It was another person named Les One who was calling the shots, who designed the Tet Offensive when General Vo Nguyen Giap, we say Giap in this country, died a few years ago at 104. The New York Times, in a very fulsome and appropriate front page to full page obituary, this hero of Dien Bien Phu, gave him credit for the Tet Offensive, when in fact he so opposed the Tet Offensive, as did Ho, that Giap's entire staff was arrested and he was sent to Hungary for medical treatment. So I mean, there was some basic fundamental tenets that began to sort of crumble as we began to research, and we realized that we had to forget everything and sort of begin anew and complement all the testimony of Americans, both for and against the war, and all the stripes in between, with North Vietnamese voices and South Vietnam voices. So military as well as civilian.
So the main message you would want somebody who would watch all of the shows to take away about the Vietnam is what?
It's complicated. No, I mean, we sort of felt all the way through that, I keep going back to something that I'm sure I bored you to death, and all the times we've had conversations, David, but when I was making my jazz film in the 90s, I was speaking with Wynton Marsalis, and he was talking about something else entirely. But he said sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing is true at the same time. And that was a huge eye-opener for me. And I think it's true of art, what art is able to do. Unlike a political dialectic, which is binary, art is able to understand the shadows that are present as well. So it means that heroes aren't uniformly good, that villains aren't uniformly bad. We sort of get that people have flaws, and heroism is itself a negotiation between flaws and strengths within a person. But I think in a larger sense, it permitted us to understand that we would better triangulate an almost unknowable phenomenon by hearing from all the different voices than by regurgitating kind of conventional wisdom or what the wisdom was that we'd arrived at today. And we found almost everything that we found to be true in one perspective looked a lot different when you were talking to a South Vietnamese civilian as opposed to an American civilian, and then again another view from a North Vietnamese civilian.
And to review, I'd remind everybody, how many American soldiers were killed in Vietnam?
A little bit over 58,000. There's several different numbers, and a lot of it has to do with how different groups, including the Department of Defense, counts them.
And at any given week, what was the highest number of people being killed?
I think the worst, the apogee, was in the spring of '68, and there were nearly 3,000 killed in a week.
In a week?
Yeah.
And how many injured, not killed?
So you've got, usually it's multiples of 10 and 20s, depending on the type and scope of battle, and that fluctuates widely.
Okay, let's go back through the history of Vietnam. So in 1954, the Dien Bien Phu falls, and the Vietnamese kind of kick out the French. So Eisenhower is president. Does Eisenhower want to do anything about that?
No, by that time, by the time of Dien Bien Phu, we were paying almost 80% of the French military budget. The American people had no idea of this, and this had been part of the strategy of first Truman and then Eisenhower. And when there was entreaties to intervene militarily at Dien Bien Phu, the general in Eisenhower and the politician in Eisenhower knew it was foolhardy, continued to support it. This was a battle that took place in advance of the Geneva meetings that would decide Vietnam's fate, and both sides wanted to sort of secure their position. So the battle happened. It was a terrible defeat for the French, and it essentially ended in the Geneva Accords that divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the stipulation that in 2 years, in '56, there would be an election which not a single person who was breathing on Earth and was sentient knew wouldn't be won by anyone else but Ho Chi Minh.
So when Eisenhower met with Kennedy, after Kennedy was elected, before Kennedy assumed office, did Eisenhower talk to Kennedy about Vietnam, what he should do with it?
Actually, Eisenhower was more interested in Kennedy intervening in a communist insurgency in Laos, which Kennedy turned him down on. And then Kennedy almost immediately stepped in it with the Bay of Pigs. He then went to Vienna and was sort of humiliated by Khrushchev there, and then couldn't keep the Soviets from building the Berlin Wall. And so he spoke frankly to aides, saying, if we don't draw the line in the sand in South Vietnam, our chances of re-election. And Kennedy, who finds himself right smack in the middle of the history that we tell, is like every other president, both before and after, is the principal important decisions about Vietnam are made based on domestic political consideration, which is, will I get reelected?
And when Kennedy assumed office, how many Americans were advisors in Vietnam?
Somewhere between 16 and 17,000 advisors. He'd inherited about 700 from Ike. And then he had understood this new evolving strategy issuing out of not just the cataclysm of World War II, but the nuclear age that ushered in, that you weren't going to fight World War III, you were going to fight proxy wars, or what he called limited wars against insurgencies, and he would do it in different places, and Vietnam was where he was going to really commit.
So how many people then, how many American advisors
But
then?
when he was killed in Dallas, there were almost 17,000.
17,000 then, but initially when he came in,
It was about 700.
700. So the ruling leader and president of South Vietnam was?
No Ding Diem, until he was assassinated by a coup 3 weeks before Kennedy was killed.
And did Kennedy support the assassination?
He did, in a way that he came to regret. There had been, his administration was very torn, as every administration had been, about what to do about Vietnam, and there are many people who said, just get out of there now. There's no good. Dien Bien Phu should have showed us that, the bridge is out 2 miles, don't crash through this barrier. But the Hawks won the day, and he tacitly, while he was on vacation in Hyannisport, approved a cable that was sent out by a deputy assistant secretary of state named Roger Hilsman that essentially gave the nod to the coup planners. There was still another month or two of debate within the administration until finally they did say to the generals who had decided to overthrow the increasingly autocratic No Ding Diem, and he was overthrown, took sanctuary in a Catholic church. He was a Catholic.
But Kennedy was surprised that Diem was assassinated.
And then they were promised his passage. Diem and his brother knew, who was a very strange man, and they were both assassinated.
So, all right, so he's surprised Diem is assassinated, and he's assassinated himself three weeks later. Many people who have written about Kennedy after he died, people who worked in the administration, said that secretly Kennedy had told them that after he was reelected, he was going to pull out of Vietnam. Is there any evidence of that?
I didn't find any, and we certainly would have done that. We're not in the what-if business. We're in the what-happened business, and it's always great to quarterback or say, gee, if we'd pulled our pitcher in the 6th inning until the 7th, we would have won that game. Well, that may be true, but that's not what happened. And so the man who took over from John F. Kennedy was Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, and he had an ambitious domestic agenda. He wanted to be the reincarnation of FDR, and he did a pretty good job of doing that despite Vietnam, but he understood that his overwhelming weakness was foreign policy, and he said, foreigners aren't like the people I know. And so he kept every single one of Kennedy's foreign policy people, Rusk at State and McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, the whole lot of them, and Maxwell Taylor, they drove him, and he drove with them consciously into the escalation that would, by the spring of '65, put the boots on the ground.
So he inherited 17,000 people, more or less, in Vietnam. When did he begin the escalation, and who prompted him to begin significant amounts of troops?
Well, what happened was there was an incident in late July and early August of 1964, which we remember as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which we had sort of gotten the South Vietnamese Navy to attack North Vietnamese islands, which were in complete violation of the Geneva Accords. And the Maddox and Turner Joy, 2 destroyers, were in the South China Sea, the Gulf of Tonkin, sort of supporting this action. When a tiny, tiny North Vietnamese Navy came out to sort of say, don't do this, and they shot a couple of torpedoes. Everything missed. We shot some torpedoes. They missed. And then carrier-based fighter planes disabled or destroyed these guys. But from that, there was sent to Congress this resolution that if anything happened, that was significant, we would do it. And a few days later, some sonar people misinterpreted some signals and thought an attack had happened. And since an attack had been probable but hadn't happened, Johnson said that it had been probable, so it was likely, and they passed the Gulf of Tonkin, and he retaliated.
How many people voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution?
Nobody in the House of Representatives. 2 in the Senate.
Morse
and Gruning.
Okay, so it's 2.
Yeah.
So that authority, there was never a declaration of war. That was all that Johnson ever had.
That's all he ever had.
And at what point as he's moving toward the re-election effort, in between 64 and 68, how many people did he have in Vietnam by 68?
It was steadily escalating the presence, but what happened is that he felt he couldn't act decisively in Vietnam until he had been elected in his own right, that he was really a caretaker president, and he did have this domestic agenda. Kennedy, who had been terrible on civil rights, had a kind of late come-to-Jesus moment and had proposed a Civil Rights Act, which Kennedy would have been impossible for Kennedy to get through. Only Lyndon Johnson could have gotten it through, knowing full well what the cost of that that Civil Rights Act would be to the Democratic Party in the South, and it is exactly what happened.
The anti-war movement began in 64, 65, and...
You've got to say that the anti-war movement is the sort of the merger of a couple of tributaries. One is an American civil rights movement, which is beginning to activate young people in the North, and it's also an internationalist, leftist, but not far left, anti-nuclear proliferation movement. And so they kind of join when you realize, and you can see there's a wonderful poster in the exhibition here in which it's saying, why are we killing these people when we're supposed to have them have an election? So there are people, internationalists, who are hanging on to the fact that the Geneva Accords suggested that there ought to have been an election 2 years after the separation, and that this, everyone knew that Ho Chi Minh would be elected to that, and it hadn't happened, and a lot of what we were doing was trying to support a regime that was trying to forestall any nationwide election.
So who were the Viet Cong?
So when Ho Chi Minh began his revolution against the French, he started an army he called the Viet Minh. And then by the late 50s, that had sort of, with the French gone, it was sort of reassembled through the work of Southern guerrillas and Les One organizing an organization that became the National Liberation Front. And the derogatory term for them was communist traitors to the country of Vietnam, or the Viet Cong is how it got abbreviated. And they are the guerrilla fighters in the South that are then augmented later on in the struggle by North Vietnamese regular soldiers.
And how many Viet Cong really, did we ever know how many there really were?
We have no idea. It's really just, it's grasping at an impossible number.
The escalation is occurring, and at what point, let's say by 67, 68, Johnson's getting ready to run for re-election. How many troops did we have then?
Almost 500,000 by that time, and over. And we peaked at over 500,000.
All the troops were largely conscripted?
Yes, there were people who volunteered in the early days of it, and they were very much committed to the cause of stopping communism, and this is where we were going to put the battle flag. And then a draft, which disproportionately in the early years fell on minorities and poor working class people, and that was slowly, for political and other good reasons, changed. The deferments if you were married, deferments if you're at college, changed to you had to be doing well at college, and then finally it was eliminated for the lottery system that many of us participated in.
So the American press was somewhat skeptical. There were a number of reporters in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth. Was Johnson upset with that press?
Well, initially that press was there, and it was Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam and Malcolm Brown and a lot of people, Peter Arnett, a lot of people that we know their work, and they went there fervently anti-communist, willing to sort of, be the cheerleaders for this new American effort, this new kind of warfare. And what they found is that the PR reports from Washington and the MACV headquarters, the military command in Saigon, were totally different from what they were seeing in the field or what the field commanders were telling them, and they started to write about it. And then Johnson said, get on the team or get out.
Now, there were things that McNamara had called body counts, I guess it was. They were counting how many bodies we had killed and so forth. How reliable were those numbers?
Well, it's one of the great tragedies. McNamara was one of those best and brightest. He'd come from the Ford Motor Company, taken a huge pay cut. He was sort of a pioneer in a field of systems analysis, and so he felt that you could quantify everything, that there was a metric that could make you understand. And so he was asking his commanders in the field for information that they couldn't provide, and they couldn't digest it, and they couldn't figure out what was happening. And so more and more they fell back on one of those metrics, which was body counts. How much of them did you kill? And pretty soon the field commanders understood that this is what they wanted to hear. So fire became indiscriminate. You weren't all necessarily had to be confident that that was an enemy combatant. It just had to be somebody that was moving, and I think they got inflated, but I also know a lot of human beings that were innocent were killed in a rush to fill these numbers.
Napalm. Why did we use napalm?
Napalm had been around since the Second World War, and it's gelatinized gasoline that has the tendency to burn really hard in wood and paper and flesh. And we'd used it in Japan, and we'd been causing McNamara to say that had we lost the Second World War, that he and Curtis LeMay would have been hung as war criminals by the Japanese. And then we had given it to the French. It's a chemical compound called 2,4,5-T, and it was called Agent Orange because, Agent Orange of the defoliants that we used, and napalm was just something that we just kept using all the time.
So Walter Cronkite made a famous visit to Vietnam.
In '68.
What did he conclude?
Well, he had gone there to cover the Tet Offensive, which had taken everybody by surprise. We should have known a little bit. Lots of stuff was going on, and there was a good deal of intelligence that something was happening, and we kept misreading that intelligence. But needless to say, on January 30th and 31st, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese in hundreds of places around South Vietnam attacked simultaneously, and it wasn't at American bases as much as it was at big cities. And their idea was that they would defeat the ARVN would run, that's the Army of South Vietnam, and that the people chafing under the autocratic rule of whatever regime is there would rise up against it. None of that happened. The Americans and the South Vietnamese won in every single one of those battles. But Cronkite was present for the most prolonged battle, which took place in the beautiful imperial city of Hue. And it went on for 26 days, I think it was, and it was just terrible. Most of the other fighting ended within 2 or 3 days in the other cities, including Saigon. But this was such a horrible thing that Cronkite had realized that we hadn't been told the truth, and he came back and said, we are not going to win this war militarily. We have to, as an honorable people, do that. And the famous phrase attributed to Johnson was never said, that if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the American people.
To remind people, when people were watching the evening news in those days, was it 15 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever?
It was more often than not 15. It was in that period that it expanded for a couple of the networks to 30 minutes.
And the film that they would have from what was going to Vietnam was 1 or 2 or 3 days old? It would be.
That's correct. We like to say it was a living room war. It really wasn't. There were no live broadcasts. 60 Minutes, CBS would bring back some of their correspondents, like Morley Safer would watch the Marines burn a village with their Zippo lighters and then come and do a kind of a white paper report on it. Photographs came back, and they were shocking, and then the film from the Tet Offensive happened. NBC ran the footage of the great famous photograph of the assassination of the North Vietnamese spy Lem by the head of the National Police, Luan, on the streets of Saigon in the middle of the heat of the thing, and it was so graphic. But NBC's footage, which they played only once, is even more so.
So Johnson intended to run for re-election. Then in March of '68, he said, I'm not going to run. And was that because he really didn't think he'd get the nomination, you believe?
I think there were a lot of factors. I think he could have gotten the nomination. I think he would have gotten the nomination had Robert Kennedy lived. But in November, Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota, declared that he was running as an anti-war candidate. In the New Hampshire election, in which Johnson was favored to win and did win, he didn't win by the 2-to-1 margin. He won by only 10 or 12 percentage points, which was enough for the anti-war movement to declare victory against him, even though many of the votes for McCarthy were protest votes from people who wanted Johnson to prosecute the war more vigorously. I mean, it's crazy stuff. And Robert Kennedy entered the race. And when that happened, I think a whole set of stuff, and Walter Cronkite, and all of these things began to sort of meet, and he had his
On the Republican side, Richard Nixon was running for the nomination, and he said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. What was that secret plan?
He didn't have a secret plan to do it.
Really?
He knew, he and his foreign policy advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger from Harvard, knew that this was an unwinnable war, and they knew they had to get out, but they knew they also had a tremendous optics problem, we would say today, which is if you go in when you win and accept the terms in January of '69 that the North Vietnamese are offering at the bargaining table in Paris, you're the first president that's lost a war.
So during the '68 election, Lyndon Johnson, maybe to help the Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey, is trying to get a bombing halt and a cessation of combat for a while. What does Richard Nixon do about that?
Well, it's very interesting. We don't really know what Johnson's motives are. I think he is taken as surprised by the fact that there seems to be some substantive progress in the peace talks, and he announces that at the end of October, just a couple of weeks before the election. And Humphrey, who's been significantly trailing, suddenly just takes off and is coming up in the poll numbers to equal Richard Nixon. Remember that there's a third-party candidate, Governor George Wallace of Alabama, also running and siphoning off traditional Democratic voters, at least in the South. And it's a very complex election, but what Richard Nixon does is that he and the Republican Party reach out through intermediaries to President Thieu of South Vietnam, and say, look, going against what they've told themselves, you'll get a better terms from us. We'll be more hardline than Humphrey. So you should boycott the talks, because it was now presumed that the talks would expand and there would be not just the North Vietnamese and the Americans, but the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese, and there would all be parties to these talks. And Thieu announced just on the eve of the election that he was going to boycott the talks, and that was a big blow to the peace process. But Johnson had CIA wiretaps and FBI intercepts on phones and cables in the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington and at the presidential palace in Saigon, and understood this. He calls Everett Dirksen, is recorded on tape, and says, Ev, his friend, the Republican senator from Illinois, this is treason. And he goes, I know, yes it is. And then Nixon calls in a day or so later saying, I'd never do anything like this to harm the peace process. He was lying. And for some reason, Johnson didn't reveal this. And I've heard from some of the Johnson people, one of the projects we're working on as LBJ's presidency, is that Humphrey may have vetoed it, not wanting to win on a kind of false thing and look like a poor sport. But it's interesting, we tend to separate Nixon between domestic and foreign policy, but the Watergate is so completely linked to his terror that somehow the Democrats are going to get a hold. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's like the Michael Steele file, the dossier. And he orders, well before Watergate, the firebombing of the Brookings Institution to get at a safe which he thinks possibly contains the incriminating evidence of his interfering with the South Vietnamese in that first election.
So he won the election in '68.
By the slimmest of margins, 43.4 to 42.7%.
And so he has a secret plan, but there really is no secret plan. So how many troops were there, American troops, in Vietnam when Nixon was
More
elected?
than 500,000.
How many?
More than 500,000.
500,000. All right, what does he do? Does he increase the number of troops?
He talks about eventually, not right away. It's basically business as usual for a while, and then he talks about drawing down the troops and withdrawing because he realized he can blunt the anti-war movement, which is growing and increasing numbers, and also militancy. And if he can isolate and drive a wedge between a vast number of folks who are just opposed to the war and those who want militant solutions to it, and he does I think a brilliant and smart thing, which was ending the unfair aspects of the draft deferments.
So what was Vietnamization? That was one of his ideas. What is that?
Well, it's an old idea. It was a French idea, which they called jaunissement, the yellowing of the fight. And it is based on the most incredibly ill-informed supposition, which is if the South Vietnamese can't win with 500,000 Americans, they're not going to win without the Americans. Just as the French thought, well, if we can teach the Vietnamese to fight for themselves, we can get out of here. It's just people trying to avoid cleaning up the mess or staying to finish it off in this case, if you're just looking at it in a cold political eye. So Vietnamization was a way of gradually turning over to the South Vietnamese army the principal fighting of not only the Viet Cong but the North Vietnamese invaders.
Now, during the spring of '70, there is some undisclosed bombing in, I guess, Cambodia.
That's correct. So we had always we've always wanted to go into Cambodia. We wanted to go into Laos. We bombed Laos. We dropped more bombs on the northeastern corner.
And the reason we wanted to do that because we thought there were supply routes there.
And they were. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is not one road. It's not like Fifth Avenue, right? It's like this braided trail of thousands of jungle paths. It's mostly in Laos and extends down into Cambodia and enters at many points in South Vietnam. And we put more bombs in the Laos portion of the trail than we dropped on Germany and Japan combined by a multiple, and didn't stop the traffic at all. But we also had a relationship with with King Norodom Sihanouk in Cambodia. When he was overthrown, a pro-Western guy, Sihanouk kind of played it both sides. And when Lon Nol came in, he was pro-Western, and that gave Nixon a chance to do what military commanders, which is to start bombing in Cambodia. And when we found out about it, the peace movement was reinvigorated.
And what happened at Kent State?
Well, there were protests at literally hundreds of American campuses, but at Kent State, it obviously became the nadir of the protest time. Protesters had burned down an old wooden ROTC building, set fire to it actually a few days before May 4th, and had prevented the fire department in Kent, Ohio from putting out the blaze. And as a result, Governor Rhodes sent National Guardsmen, basically the same age as the students, there with live ammunition. And at some point, one of the companies was retreating. It was very tense. Some people were just walking to classes, not involved. One of the students who was killed was an ROTC student who was just walking by. And they turned and fired on a parking lot. And we still, to this day, don't know entirely how the order was given, why they did it, what they perceived the threat. But 4 young people, 2 men and 2 women, were killed, several injured, 1 paralyzed for life. And it was an overwhelmingly popular event, in polling told us.
Towards the 72 election, Nixon's running for re-election. He wants to say that there's some progress. He sends Henry Kissinger out to the press briefing room, which is the first time he was ever allowed to speak in public because of his accent.
Thick German accent, yes.
So they thought he sounded like Dr. Strangelove, so they never actually would let him. It's true, they never let him speak publicly before. So they sent him out there. What did he say, and what was the basis for his statement?
Well, he had begun to see that there was a huge appetite on the part of the 2 North Vietnamese patrons, the Soviet Union and Communist China, to just get it taken care of. Like, stop arguing the small points. And so there had been real progress at the bargaining table, and there had been concessions that, they would permit the North Vietnamese troops that are already in South Vietnam to remain there, which was the death knell of South Vietnam, if you're looking at it from a negotiating standpoint. So he was extremely happy. But what happened is that the chief North Vietnamese negotiator, Le Duc Tho, was basically conceding points without consulting with his southern brethren, the Viet Cong, and they were unhappy. So all of a sudden, the peace talks sort of ground to the halt just at the moment when he was saying everything was going very well.
So the Pentagon Papers are released at one point. What were the Pentagon Papers, and why was Nixon so upset? Because it really wasn't about his administration so much.
So at one point in the war, I think reflecting his from the beginning anxiety that this wasn't the right thing to do, Robert McNamara had ordered Leslie Gelb, a civilian employee of the Pentagon, and Robert Gard, a military attaché, to begin a kind of history project in his closet, as he put it, which was a big room, and collect the data going back to the Truman administration of the history of our involvement in Vietnam. And it is this damning portrait of president after president and diplomat after diplomat making the wrong decision and knowing full well that this was not going to work out, but saying the exact opposite to the American people. And they were working with a subcontractor, the RAND Corporation, and on the RAND Corporation staff was an ex-State Department guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who had been in Vietnam, served a year there, had been very gung-ho about the war, but had grown disillusioned with it back at the RAND Corporation. And when he read this report, he began with a comrade there named Anthony Russo to copy the material, and then, as you know, the rest of the story, Neil Sheehan and the New York Times began to print it, and now, as the celebrated movie The Post did, they joined them.
Now, Nixon is reelected overwhelmingly against George McGovern in 1972. How does the Vietnam War begin to wind down?
Well, he's already begun to pull out troops, and by the time that he's reelected, there are almost no American combat troops there. And what happens between the time of his reelection and taking office in his second term is a kind of just devolution into a civil war, which is, without a doubt, in anybody's mind, is going to end up in a North Vietnamese
Ultimately, the
victory.
peace agreement is signed.
And the peace agreement is signed in late January of '73, I think it is, and we had also done a little smoke and mirrors saying, well, it's not about all the things we said it's it's about POWs, you know? It's about getting our soldiers back. And as one reporter told, or a military person told a reporter, you'd think we came all the way to South Vietnam from the other side of the world to get back our 600 prisoners.
How many, is that how many we had, 600?
About it.
And
how many?
Some of them were there for 8 or 9 years.
Well, Everett Alvarez was shot down in early August of '64, and this is the spring of '63. So you can do the math. That's a long time. And we interviewed Everett for our thing, and we also followed other POWs, and you know probably the most famous one is John McCain.
So Nixon leaves office because of Watergate. Gerald Ford becomes president. What is his role now in trying to end the final...
He can't do anything, because what has happened is that the will of the American people has changed. Against the war. They may have overwhelmingly reelected Richard Nixon, but the scandal of Watergate is also turning people against the Republican Party, and the people who not only believe we should have never gotten into Vietnam, which has been a majority for several years, has now a majority of Americans think we should get out of Vietnam right away, no questions asked. And so their elected representatives in Congress begin to cut off funding. And Ford can argue for sort of emergency funds to keep up military stuff, but it's not going to happen. And eventually it's just pulling the Americans out. And through the stupidity of the American ambassador in South Vietnam, many of the options for evacuation are cut off because he refuses to say that Saigon's going to fall. And so we end up getting a fraction of the South Vietnamese people out that we wanted to.
So there's the famous helicopter taking off from the American...
That is not the embassy. That is one of several collection points throughout Saigon. It's an apartment building or an office building of several stories that has a tower on it. It was an appropriate landing zone, not for the big Hueys, but for the smaller helicopters and the line of people
The
sneaking
South Vietnamese who supported Americans but didn't get on a helicopter, were they killed? Or what happened?
There was a great fear there was going to be a bloodbath, and no doubt, particularly in the countryside, there were many, many thousands of acts of personal retribution within the kind of small communities of which some people would be in support of the government, some people would be neutral, some people would have joined the Viet Cong, and it was terrible. The Vietnamese that took over, the North Vietnamese when they were victorious, now Vietnamese, said that ordinary soldiers would spend only a few days in re-education camps, and officers, it might be a month or so. We interviewed one of our interviewees, a South Vietnamese General T, spent 17 years in a re-education camp.
How many Vietnamese actually came to the United States as a result of the war?
I think it's over 500,000 came. There millions of people tried to get, not millions, but several million got out of Vietnam, boat people, and went to various places. Many died along the route, tragically.
Now, historically, when we fought a war, when the war was over, the American soldiers were honored. We had ticker tape parades for them and so forth. What happened in Vietnam with the soldiers?
Well, a lot of it had to do with this is the first time the American people had been, by the time the war ended, against the war. But I would like to say that it's a much more complicated thing. There were no ticker tape parades of those kinds. Some towns did do that. Some soldiers were welcomed home. But the way the Army recruited and deployed and then returned soldiers was singular. It was everybody came home alone. Everybody went to war alone and came home from war alone. And so there was not the opportunity that we had in previous wars.
You mean they flew them over commercial planes or something? Or?
Sometimes chartered commercial planes, but you didn't come home so that your town would do something unless your town was disposed to do something. So the opportunities for that, but you already had a public, and the advice, I mean, we all hear the stuff about they spit on me or they did this or whatever, but essentially the saddest thing to me is that people said, go home, grow your hair long, don't take off your uniform, don't say anything.
Why was it so controversial to build a memorial to those who died in Vietnam?
I think because the war was so contested itself that it became, as we find ourselves incapable of doing today, avoiding the binary responses of politics. There has to be something wrong with whatever you're going to do because the war was so contentious, then a memorial, a priori would be.
Thank you very much for doing this for the country, and extraordinary, and I've watched it, and I'm going to watch it again and again. I hope everybody else does, and thank you again for being a great American and producing this. Thank you.